Thank you all very much, and my apologies for the misunderstanding on the timing this morning. I'm really happy that your flexibility has prevailed here. Let me begin with making a distinction that I think is important for the study of personality, and that is between human nature on the one hand and variations in human nature on the other. So when we think of human nature, we think of those fundamental features of being a human being that we all share by virtue of the fact that we are part of the same species and that we have evolved to meet certain evolutionary demands and so forth. So we are all social animals and we all have allegiances to groups and all that kind of thing. Very interesting stuff. But personality is not so much about that. Personality is about the variations on the general design. And so I just put 4 variations on the screen for you. These are people. Maybe some of them famous. You may know that's Lady Gaga there on the left, the pop musical and theatrical star. It's the late Steve Jobs, the founder of of Apple. Oprah Winfrey, something of a hero of mine, who's a celebrity and philanthropist and so forth. Oh, and that other one there, that's my daughter, Ruth McAdams. Okay, so these are 4 people, you might say. And in my new book on personality, my textbook, I introduce the whole field by talking about these 3 people. I leave my daughter out of it, but I talk about these 3 people and how each of them is certainly a human being, as are you and SMI, but they are a variation on the design, as am I, as are you. Each of us is a once in a lifetime, once in an eternity experiment, if you will, between nature and nurture. It's as if nature and nurture got together one day and said, let's try this one out. Let's make a Lady Gaga. Let's make a Dan McAdams. Personality psychology studies the variations. What makes Lady Gaga different from you? How am I similar to and different than Oprah Winfrey? And so when I think about this variation in the general design of human nature, I think about it in terms of 3 different layers, you might say, of personality. This slide is basically the thesis of my talk that I'm going to defend. First of all, each of us is an actor in the world, a social actor, and each of us plays our role in a unique way. And early on in life, even at the beginning, we start to see the variations in that style that the actor shows. And eventually those variations, they grow up as we do, and they become the dispositional traits that personality psychologists love to study, like extroversion and conscientiousness and so forth. So that's one layer of personality. But a second layer starts to form somewhere in maybe middle school, or elementary school here in the US, maybe age 7, 8, 9, somewhere in there, where we become a second kind of thing. We become agents. That is to say, we begin to develop goals and values for our lives, and each of us does it differently. And so there's variation with respect to the motivated agent that starts to kick in our childhood. So in that sense, personality begins to thicken. You've got the dispositional traits, but now you also have goals and values. And then finally, in our late teens, early 20s, for most of us, we become what I call autobiographical authors. We begin to construct stories for our lives, to provide our lives with a sense of meaning and purpose. And those stories are part of personality too. They are layered over the goals and values, which are layered over the dispositional traits, such that by the time we hit the age that the people in the room are, and me, we have a pretty thick personality, 3 layers of variation. Let's talk about each of the 3 now. The first, layer 1, the social actor. And we take as our inspiration here this wonderful quote, you all know it, from As You Like It, William Shakespeare's play, where he says, or actually it's Jacques who's giving a soliloquy in this play. Jacques says or proclaims, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. And this is just so profound. We are all social actors. We are always displaying, we are always on stage, even when we go home and we are all by ourselves in bed thinking. There is a sense in which we are still performing, right? We are still playing roles. There are scripts, there are norms, there are expectations for how we do that, but each of us does it differently. And each of us does it in part driven by the dispositional traits that begin to form early on in personality development. And Mark's talked about the big five traits. Many of you are likely familiar with this fundamental conception in personality science. The idea being that there are five big clusters or families of broad dispositions that come up again and again in factor analytic studies of personality. And they are easy to remember if you remember the word in English: ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And these big five traits, they sort of script out the biggest, broadest, kind of most fundamental variational constructs at the level of the social actor. Some people play their roles with tremendous gusto and enthusiasm. We call them extroverts. We see them as socially dominant people who walk into the room and command the audience. And some people score high on extroversion, and that shapes how they do their roles, how they play their scripts, and so forth. Agreeableness, warmth, care, compassionate nature. Neuroticism, a tendency towards negative emotionality. Conscientiousness, being very well regulated, being very punctual and focused and achievement oriented. And openness, being very open-minded and so forth. Each of these five is a disposition, and there is variation on them. And personality psychologists, they spend a lot of their time tracking that variation in social actors. Developmental psychologists who've looked at this have suggested, based on research, that the five factors of personality traits actually can be traced back to three or more basic temperaments that begin to show up in the first 2 years of life. In the case of these first two temperaments, from very, very early on. So there's, first of all, positive emotionality, the tendency to embrace and experience positive emotion, to be a kind of cheerful, upbeat person. You see differences here even by the time babies are 3 or 4 months of age. Some babies seem dispositionally somewhat more cheerful, somewhat easier to placate, and so forth. Other babies, maybe not so much, a little more reticent, a little less positive emotionality. Well, you're starting to see they're the foreshadows, or the harbingers of what will eventually become extroversion, this broad trait that encompasses so much about the social actor's disposition. So positive emotionality is a little bit of a hint at that. And then over time, through the interaction of environments and the person, and this is sculpted and shaped, and there is a movement in personality development from early positive emotionality to later extroversion. It's not a one-to-one mapping, but some of the roots of extroversion go back that far. Ditto with neuroticism, the tendency to experience stress, to feel negative emotions, and so forth. We start to see harbingers or foreshadowings of that even in the first few months of life. Some babies show a highly irritable, negative temperament. Not all the time. Sometimes they're cheerful, but you can distinguish children based on these dispositions. Anybody who's had more than one kid knows that temperament is a thing, that young children come out of the womb, and there are certain dispositions you begin to see early on. They are shaped, they change, they evolve over time, but neuroticism may have its roots partly in early negative emotionality. And then finally, there's this very important temperament disposition that begins to emerge in the second and third year of life, called effortful control. And this one is more about the child's ability to sort of take a deep breath, step back, and monitor their behavior. There are lots of other ways to describe effortful control. Sometimes it's called delay of gratification. But what it's fundamentally about is the ability to sort of check yourself in some sense or another, to slow down for a moment and maybe not go with the impulse, but like take a moment, assess the situation, and engage in a behavior that is appropriate for the situation, even if it bypasses or overwhelms your impulse. Effortful control may be at the root of differences in conscientiousness and agreeableness. There are obviously other factors as well. So in a nutshell here, there is research to suggest that there is a move across time in personality development from early temperament dispositions like positive emotionality, negative emotionality, and effortful control. These early variations over time morph and change and transform, and voila, by the time you're in your teens and so forth, we see these 5 traits. They're not fixed forever. They change too over time, but this is one line of development in personality, and it's very important. It's foundational. But there is more to personality development than that. Oh, and by the way, as we are developing as social actors, we eventually come to see ourselves in that manner. Personality psychologists assess individual differences in traits by effectively asking you and me and anybody else who does a trait scale or makes a trait rating to consider ourselves an object, to look at ourselves. I look at me, and to assess what we see. Trait understanding is kind of interesting this way. It's not like deep inside you feel that you're high in conscientiousness and that eventually wells up and you understand yourself. That's not how it plays out. It's more like this. As a kid, people start saying things about you. You know what? You're a good student. Or, you know, we can count on you. We can depend on you. And you start to notice, whoa, this is how I'm seen. There's a social reputation that I've got. I must be that kind of person, right? We learn about our traits not through not through introspection so much, in my view, but rather through monitoring the observations of others and then doing the same kind of thing, stepping back and looking at ourselves. Well, 1-year-olds, they can't do that. They have traits already, they have temperaments, but they don't understand their traits. But later on, we come to see ourselves as social actors who have certain kinds of traits, and maybe we try to change those traits, right? But we wouldn't understand them if we weren't able to internalize the social reputations that we sort of understand in the world. So in that sense, the apprehensions of one's own traits develop from the outside in. At the second layer of personality development, the movement is the reverse. It's not so much here that it's from the outside in. It's not like you gauge what your social reputation is and then you say, oh, those are my traits. That's not happening here. What's happening here is something that comes from the inside out. As we move into the elementary school years and thereafter, personality thickens in the sense that there is now a new line of variation that is important to consider. And that is the line of the motivated agent. A goal is a dream with a deadline, Napoleon Hill once wrote. Einstein said, if you want to live a happy life, tie it to a goal, not to people or things. Well, I'm not sure Einstein was right about that second statement, but he certainly had a point with respect to the first. How we apprehend goals, motivations, and how our values and beliefs shape that, we all see this as central to who we are as human beings and how we are different from other people, right? This is about then our understanding of ourselves as motivated agents. This is not a way that babies think about themselves. And this is not something that we think about when we look at a 2-year-old. If I see a 2-year-old child here and I notice layer one, I say, well, this kid is friendly and fun, and I'm having a good time talking to him. I'm not asking myself as I'm interacting with a 2-year-old, I'm not asking myself, I wonder what this kid believes, right? What is this kid's philosophy of life? What is this child's religious perspective? Who's this kid going to vote for in the 2024 election? It's not in my head. This is not a motivated agent here. This kid doesn't really have goals that go beyond like momentary ones or short term. But by the time the child is, say, 8 or 9, you start to ask questions like that. There are some developmental milestones that indeed emerge in childhood that eventually usher in the motivated agent. And they include a number of interesting things that developmental psychologists study, such as theory of mind. Theory of mind is this understanding in your head that kicks in around age 4 or so, your understanding of motivation, your understanding that, oh, people do things because they want to do those things, right? Why did I eat that cookie? Because I'm hungry and I wanted to eat that cookie. Well, that's kind of obvious to you and me, but that insight that people have minds, that in their minds there are wants and desires and beliefs, and that people act on those. And that's how we explain behavior. That kind of kicks in somewhere shortly before kindergarten, it seems, developmental psychologists suggest. And related is what people call the age 5 to 7 shift, where children move across early childhood from being captive by the moment and by their mainly momentary needs and concerns, and very self-oriented and what Piaget called egocentric. We move from that perspective to something that's a little more well-regulated, so that 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds are more planful. They have greater executive function, as developmental psychologists talk about. They can reason through situations better. They have a long-term perspective. They start to understand their goals. They begin to develop moral values and so forth, such that we start to consider kids at this time in terms of what Aristotle long ago called character. He made a distinction in his study of virtues, Aristotle did, between habit on the one hand and character on the other. Habit is the social actor. A 3-year-old can be a nice person and that's part of the social actor's disposition. A 9-year-old can reason through things a little bit, make decisions, decide if they're going to be nice or not in a given situation. We hold the 9-year-old perhaps more accountable, if you will, for their goals and their plans and their behaviors than the 2-year-old. This is a shift, gradual over childhood. And it also leads to the emergence of self-esteem, such that by the time kids are 7 or 8, they're able to sort of look at themselves and decide, as motivated agents, am I achieving my goals? Am I doing well in gaining or pursuing what I want, what I value in life? An 8-year-old might get a little down, might feel that I don't feel good about myself because I'm not doing well in school. I'm not getting the kind of grades I want. My friend over here, Jessica, she just rejected me. I'm feeling bad about that. I'm starting to see my self-esteem in a more negative way. Self-esteem is often about comparing what you want in life to where you are in terms of getting it. And that's not something 2-year-olds can do. But 7, 8, 9-year-olds begin to be able to do that because they have this broader understanding of self. It's the motivated agents, the beginnings of a prospective motivational agenda where you are able to ask yourself, what do I want? What do I value? And then you get to the good stuff. right? Or the stuff I love to study. The layer three, the autobiographical author. All along, the other two layers are developing. Your traits are developing over time as a social actor. They don't stop. That's a line of development that continues from birth to the end of life. And once you become a motivated agent, layer two, your goals, your values, your beliefs, your moral agenda, your motivational perspective, those continue to develop over time too. And people differ on that. And we can talk about those differences as basic personality differences, even though they're not traits, they're goals and values. And then somewhere along the way, what Erik Erikson here, the great psychoanalytic theorist of the middle part of the 20th century, said, called identity, starts to like kick in. Now, Marcus mentioned that I taught at Loyola University of Chicago many years ago. It was my first job coming out of graduate school. And I taught courses in developmental psychology, mainly back then. And I was then and still am enamored by the writings of Erik Erikson. And I organized the class back then partly in terms of Erikson's stages of development. And for you who know them, and they're pretty well known, the fifth stage is the one that people are often most interested in, the stage of identity versus role confusion. And Erikson suggested that in late adolescence, maybe young adulthood, we confront this problem in our lives that we didn't have before, the problem of identity. And it's about who am I? And how do I fit into the adult world? And it's such an interesting idea. And I would ask the students, well, what is this though? Right? I mean, Erikson describes it as an arrangement of the self. In your late teens and early 20s, you start to rearrange yourself so that you feel a sense of sameness and temporal continuity. Whatever this identity is, it helps you understand who you are now, who you were before, who you may be in the future. It kicks in. The desire to understand identity seems to kick in the late teens and early 20s. Developing an identity situates a person in the world within a niche in adult society. And Erikson argued, it's something you make. You don't go off to the mountain and discover your identity. That's not the model. He's not a humanistic psychologist like that. He's more grounded in the psychosocial reality of everyday life. In your conversations, in your interactions, eventually you construct an identity. But like, what is it? If you could see an identity and touch it, what would it look like? What would it feel like? And I would ask the students this in our classes, and we tried out all kinds of methods, and nothing seemed to work. And then eventually this idea kind of popped up, right? Well, maybe identity is a story, right? Maybe that's basically what identity is, because stories do this. Stories arrange things, beginning, middle, and end. Maybe people are walking around with narratives in their heads, stories that situate them in the world, that explain who I was once upon a time, who I am now, who I may be in the future. If you had a story like that in your mind, that might provide you with the sense of sameness and temporal continuity that Erikson suggested identity gives you. And so, yeah, maybe identity's a story. Let's call it that. Eventually, the concept emerged out of these ideas called narrative identity, an internalized and evolving story of the self that explains how I came to be the person I am becoming. Your life story incorporates a reconstruction of the past and an anticipation of an imagined future. People differ in terms of their life stories in the same way they differ with respect to their values and goals, and they differ with respect to their traits. Author, agent, actor. So now we're talking about the author, this third layer of personality that kicks in. I began in the late 1980s to do interviews with people, to ask them to tell the stories of their lives. We still do these interviews in our research, and they follow along pretty much like this slide suggests. You begin the interview by talking about your life as if it were a novel and divide it up into chapters. Give me a little title and plot summary for each chapter. And then the interview zeroes in on key moments, scenes, like high points, low points, turning points, the most important episodes, specific scenes that stand out in your memory as you look back on your life. Who are the important characters, the heroes and the villains in your life story? Where is the story going? Most of the people I interview and my lab focuses on are midlife-ish, okay? Maybe 30s, 40s, 50s, sometimes a little older, sometimes a little younger. And so there's a lot of life ahead. What's the next chapter gonna look? Towards the end of the interview, we ask about personal beliefs and values, which I call an individual's ideological setting. And then finally, at the end of the interview, and it's about an hour and a half or two, it's much more detailed than this slide suggests, we ask the interviewee to become reflective and to say, like, well, what do you think this story says about who you are? What is the fundamental message or motif, if there is one, that runs through your life story? Now, pretty much everybody has a life story by the time they get into their adult years. Narrative identity, I don't think it's necessarily a universal, but it is common, especially in Western industrialized societies. People do want to create these stories for their lives, to provide their lives with meaning and purpose. And so, well, you have to decide, or I had to decide as a researcher early in my career, whose stories am I most interested in? And I decided I want to study highly generative adults. This is another term from Erickson, where he's talking about generativity as a desire to have a positive impact on the next generation. People who are highly generative, they're working hard to make a positive difference for the future. They are highly productive and caring people. There's a whole line of research that I won't bore you with right now, looking at individual differences in generativity in people's lives. And so I was very interested in understanding the most generative people I could find and comparing their life stories to people who are maybe not so generative, because in a way, generativity, that's a hard thing to do with your life. To commit yourself as a parent or a teacher or a mentor or somebody who's really focused on making a positive difference, to commit yourself to that kind of enterprise is risky, it seems to me. Generativity often brings a lot of problems and misery, but it can also be very rewarding. I suspect if you're a highly generative adult, you need a certain kind of story maybe to support that effort. And so let's look at a few of these excerpts from stories told by highly generative adults. I just pulled these from old data. So let's talk first of all about a 57-year-old woman who we interviewed years ago because she was a person very high in generativity based on other measures that go beyond the interview itself. And we asked her, tell us about a negative childhood scene. And this is what she said. I was in first grade and I was told I had this terrible illness. Turns out it's rheumatoid arthritis that would make my knees swollen and I was going to have to stay in bed. And at the Catholic school, the nuns, they were so great. I mean, they said, you know, honey, you're very special to have this. God would only do this to somebody very, very special. And so that gave a little kid an idea of, oh, so this isn't something I should be feeling sorry for myself about. This should be, well, a gift. And I was stupid enough that I bought it. But I'm telling you, it helped. This is an interesting story here. She's sort of suggesting that this was bad, but at the same time, I'm kind of glad that I was stupid enough to believe the nuns because it helped me thinking that God had chosen me. There's two themes here I want to underscore. The first is what we might call early advantage. The narrator indicates that he or she has experienced an advantage or distinction, physical, material, social, that singles them out for special positive attention. God chose me for this illness. Secondly, there's what we call a redemption sequence. The narrator describes a movement from a demonstrably negative situation to a positive outcome. Keep those two themes in mind and we'll go to another. little excerpt. This is a negative childhood scene again. And here it's told by a highly generative 64-year-old white man. It's important to know that he's white in the context of American race relations. And he says this: I was probably in first grade, and my brother was probably 4 years old when we were playing in the front yard, bored out of our minds, as we always were. And a neighbor lady basically abducted us. It was a Sunday, I guess, and she took us to the Baptist church. And my mom let her do it so she could sleep in and get some rest from us. Billy and I became devout Christians, Billy being the brother, and that was mainly good. But the church was all white. So when the blacks moved into the neighborhood, well, the church bus got rerouted so that it would not go down those streets. I was probably in 8th grade when that happened, and it bothered me a lot. I wanted to speak out against it, but I was afraid. I mean, there were serious racists in this church, including some of my friends. So I just shut up. Looking back, well, it was bad and good, I guess. I mean, I stayed with my Christian faith, but I rejected the racism. Still today, that is what I am about. One of the reasons I volunteer at the food pantry and support progressive political candidates is that I believe that I am doing God's work when I do that. Yeah, even if my childhood church had some backward ideas. There are 3 themes I want to highlight in that excerpt. The first is what we would call sensitivity to the suffering of others. The narrator expresses awareness of or sympathy for pain or problems that other people experience, or shows a sensitivity to perils, dangers, or broad problems in society. We see that with the racism in this particular account. There's also moral steadfastness. The narrator emphasizes strong religious, political, or social value. Highly generative adults, they love to do that. They love to tell you about how their values motivate their behavior, how their values are central to their identity and unshakable. And finally, pro-social goals. The narrator sets forth or describes goals, plans, or hopes that involve contributing to the well-being of others beyond one's own. I just very briefly, too briefly, highlighted 5 themes in those 2 stories that I told you that both come from life story interviews from highly generative adults. Let me arrange them here on the screen and give you a quick feel for what this kind of story seems like. These are what I call 5 life story themes of the redemptive self. And as you'll see in a moment, highly generative adults, at least in American society, they tend to tell these kinds of stories about their lives, more so than do less generative adults. The stories often begin with this sense of early advantage, right? I'm special, I'm fortunate. God chose me for this illness, as we see in the first narrative. Maybe mom liked me the best. Whatever, the narrator specifies something early in the interview about how they enjoyed some special advantage early in life. And at the same time, the second bubble on the far left there, suffering of others. I was aware, as we all were, fairly early in life, that the world is a dangerous place and that people suffer. Right, we all know that. But in this life story interview, going back, would you highlight that? Highly generative adults love to tell you about this kind of thing, as if to suggest, I was special, I was lucky, but others weren't. The world suffers. And so I am like the gifted protagonist who journeys forth into a dangerous world. And as I journey forth, I'll tell you about moral depth and steadfastness. I've got my values. Maybe they're religious, maybe they're political or social. Highly generative adults will tell you about that in great and clear terms. They will sometimes suggest that they struggled for a while to get those values straightened out, but they're not struggling anymore in their midlife years. They know their values. And there's sometimes almost a kind of overzealous righteousness that comes with these stories. As much as I admire highly generative adults, sometimes these stories sound a little bit like that. And then there's the key theme of redemption. Bad things happen in my life because bad things happen in everybody's life. That's how people narrate suffering is one of the key themes in the literature on narrative identity. And highly generative adults, they will often narrate suffering in such a way as to suggest that something positive followed that. And finally, as I look to the future, I see growth, I see pro-social engagement, I see that I'm going to continue to make a positive difference in the world. So would you tell your life story that way? Highly generative American adults are more likely to tell you stories that resemble this, more so than less generative adults. And here are just some quantitative data to back this up. The first line going across being the important point here in a study of 157 midlife adults. We did interviews with all of them. We coded these interviews. It took years to do this. Lots of nuances and details here. But the ultimate results here are simple correlations, or in the second line there, multiple regression betas. It's all the same thing. And what they all suggest to you is, yeah, there's something to this idea. People who score high on self-report measures of generativity, they tend to have more of each of those 5 themes: early advantage, suffering of others, moral steadfastness, redemption sequences, and pro-social goals, as it would go across the top of the table. And then finally, the composite. Put them all together in a quantitative index, and that is highly associated with the redemptive, with generativity. So people high in generativity, also people scoring higher in psychological well-being to a certain extent, they too tend to tell this kind of story about their life, more so than do less generative people, midlife adults who are enjoying less positive emotion. Finally, it might not be surprising to see that there's a linkage here between the redemptive self and basic dispositional traits. Certain social actors tell certain kinds of stories as autobiographical authors. The redemptive self, those themes I just described, those 5, tend to be positively associated with self-report measures of agreeableness and conscientiousness. Also extroversion, which kind of surprises me, but that comes up, and negatively associated with neuroticism. No links here to openness. There is something about this particular story of the redemptive self that I think resonates with many Americans. In my book on the redemptive self, I talk about different flavors of redemptive stories that Americans love. Stories of liberation, for example, stories of recovery. Oprah Winfrey is arguably the most eloquent and influential spokesperson for the redemptive self in the world, or was for a long time. Stories of atonement, the move from sin to salvation. Stories of upward social mobility. Highly generative American adults, they just love to tell these kind of stories about their lives. And these stories support their generative efforts, for better and for worse. There are some shortcomings to these kinds of stories that we might want to talk about, but they are a kind of go-to narrative for highly generative American adults. So in conclusion, I have told you about one line of work on narrative identity, and I've situated it within this model of the 3 layers of personality. And so summing it up just from a distance, we can say again that personality and its development is an individual's unique psychological variation on the general evolutionary design for human nature. We are all humans. We are all designed the same with respect to human nature, but there's variation, and that's where personality comes in. The variation is interesting to us. It's socially consequential as a developing pattern of, first, dispositional traits, the person as social actor, second, characteristic goals and values, the person as motivated agent, and third, integrative life stories, the person as an autobiographical author, complexly and differentially situated, as all our lives are, in history and in culture. Thank you very much.
We have a question, Hans?
Yes, maybe if you move closer to the microphone, then the sounds better. You don't have to be close, but closer.
Can you just go out? I hope you can hear me. I was wondering if you could maybe dwell on certain cultural influence or certain cultural variants, because this whole narrative self thing which you ended with, it sounds very American. I don't mean it in any disrespectful way, but it's more like living the American dream. It has certain recollections to certain evangelical Christianity stories of how you encountered Jesus and it saved your life and it brought everything right. I was wondering if you see something similar in non-American settings, like Europe or maybe Asia or Africa. Has it been researched in any case?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a deja vu experience for me. Thank you for that question. In this sense, 20 years ago, I was just getting some early results on this. It might have been a little more than 20, like 23 years ago or so. I was just getting some early results that look a little bit like what I just described. And my pitch was these highly generative adults, midlife adults, they tend to tell these stories of redemption. And isn't this interesting? And can't you see how these stories might support a redemptive, a generative life? And I was speaking in the Netherlands, I think in Nijmegen, and a young woman in the front row at the end said almost exactly what you said. She said, you know, Professor McAdams, interesting, blah, 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 but these stories sound so American to us. And at the moment, I said, I don't know, maybe, but, you know, don't people always want to overcome adversity? I just kind of did some hand waving, wasn't sure how to respond to that. On the flight home, I decided she's totally right. They're completely American in many ways. And so I kind of did a 180, really. By the time I landed in Chicago, I had an epiphany. And that is, I'm going to study these kinds of stories as American texts. And you are exactly correct. There's the influence of evangelical Christianity that you hear in these kinds of stories. There's the American dream, as Benjamin Franklin described it 250 years ago in his autobiography. Americans love these stories about going from rags to riches, even though our society has less upward social mobility than many other societies in the Western Hemisphere have. Nonetheless, we hold on to these myths, stories of overcoming adversity, stories of finding my true self after I lost it. Oprah talks that way. It's a very American way of talking. I don't believe that these kinds of stories support generativity in all societies or even many others. But in this particular one that I focused on, there does seem to be a connection. There is interest in the narrative identity literature on what are called master cultural narratives, with the notion being that each society has its own go-to stories that support a caring and productive life. And so it wouldn't necessarily look like this in other cultures.
I think it was about the same time, so I think it was, okay.
Can you hear me if I speak from here? Okay,
Yes.
I just wanted to add something on Hans's question. I pretty much had the same point that I wanted to make about the cultural context of these stories. So I come from the Nordic countries, and the stories that we tell are pretty much completely opposite. So the basic Nordic story is not the rags from riches story; it's the story of a tragic hero. And that's always the template for the story. So there's someone who has great aspirations and overcomes a lot of adversity, but at the same time, because of his or her own vices and a number of other things, fails to live up to those things and then dies tragically. Usually kills themselves at the end. And this is the basic story. But this, although it sounds quite sad, from a personality point of view, it also gives a lot of leeway or respect or value to things like failures. And then this is again one of these things that I've seen myself after living in the US, is that when you fail in Finland, people don't think you're a bad person. But if you fail in the US, people think that there's something wrong with you. So there's this idea of success and achievement that is coupled together, whereas in context where the stories are more tragic, there's more understanding for failure and these rough edges of life. Well, that was just comment rather than a question.
Yes, that's great. I completely resonate with what you're describing. That makes a lot of sense to me. I recently have been developing a line of work that came up in a paper. There's a paper that's come out of it. It's entitled Beyond the Redemptive Self. And this is a consideration, even within American society, of certain other kinds of stories that support psychological health in one way or another, especially as you get older. So this is put more in a life course perspective, but you could apply it culturally as well. So there are these stories, I call them stories of acceptance. And in a story of maybe acceptance isn't the right word, but some radical acceptance. And this is the case. You can't overcome the adversity, right? You're not going to win. We're all going to die, let's face it. You're not going to triumph. The redemptive story is so triumphant, right? But there are situations in life, increasingly as you get older and in other contexts of constraint, where you can't overcome adversity. You have to manage it. And the managing of adversity is a different kind of story. It's a story where the protagonist is actually rather much more vulnerable, subject to failure, as you suggest, and so on. And that sense of vulnerability of the protagonist also carries with it the virtues of grace and flexibility. And this kind of story, while not a redemptive story, nonetheless can support people in certain kinds of contexts, especially I suggest when you're older, but it could be applied in lots of other sort of situations. So I think one of the constraints or limitations of the redemptive narratives that Americans love so much, especially these highly generative Americans, is that they don't allow for what you're describing. They don't allow for failure. They don't give you a sense of that the protagonist can be vulnerable and gracious and flexible. That's a different kind of narrative. And, it's not as prevalent in American society, but there are shades of it here and there.
I think it's Amber, then Brian, and then Anita. So my name is Amber Griffin. Nice to virtually meet you. I have a question that's very similar to Aku's. I mean, I was thinking about it from the Chinese context since I teach at a Chinese university. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. They are, with a lot of my students, I mean, success, like wealth, power, high social status, is seen as a virtue, like a moral virtue. And so there's a sense in which someone is, responsible for their success. But when it comes to failure, quite the opposite is true. So, success is a virtue, but failure is not a vice. And normally they kind of express, well, they're going to talk about systemic issues or, not being able to think that somebody can't overcome. And so I was really thinking like about the role of failure in some of the stories that you've been looking at. Do you find that stories that really integrate failure as a central feature? Well, first, you find stories that integrate failure as a central feature. And are there some that aren't just like acceptance, like, yeah, I couldn't overcome adversity, but I'm okay with that, but rather where failure is used as a stepping stone towards greater success, or where failure becomes central, but still reflects growth or adaptiveness or something like that?
Yes. In fact, the redemptive narratives are elastic enough to encompass the kind of thing you're describing. People talk about failure quite a bit in these life stories. Even highly generative adults will talk about failure. They don't always use that word because the interview is a lot about social and emotional relationships and so forth. So they'll talk about disappointments, they'll talk about suffering, they'll talk about setbacks and so forth. Sometimes the word failure comes up. The interview is not a success versus failure kind of discourse. That's not a big idea. But yes, those kinds of things do come up a lot, and integrating it into your life story as a kind of stepping stone. I learned from the failure. I gained an insight in my life. That's a classic redemptive move in the redemptive self. So I don't want to shortchange the redemptive self and suggest that it's always about like, this triumphal sort of overcoming. Sometimes, often indeed, it's about integrating failure, integrating disappointments and so forth into my story in such a way that I acknowledge them. I talk about the pain and so forth, but I nonetheless also try to find something meaningful or in that can help me develop a better life. So I think that's consistent redemptive story.
Thank you so much for the talk, and thanks for your patience with all of our questions so far. I'm going to have to ask for more patience because I'm going to ask another question kind of along the same lines. And my main question actually is there research on interventions to change the way people tell their life stories, and what does it show us? The reason I'm asking is because it would seem to me like that kind of research would be one way to address the causal relationship between generativity and life narrative. So some of the questions we've asked, we might be wondering, well, maybe the causation goes the other way. It's that like these American individuals, they become highly generative, and then it's like, all right, now you became highly generative, and you've got to come up with this kind of story about your life. So tell us, what's your story? So I'm wondering if there's research of this sort, and if it would support the idea that no, it's the life narrative that comes first and makes a difference for people's generative.
Yeah, that's great. There's two parts to that, to your question. One has to do with the interventions, and the other has to do with and they're linked, the causal nature here, what comes first, that sort of thing. Let me speak to the second one first. And that is, I think most people, when they think of this work, they imagine it as the story changes. The story is causal. So the story sets you up. So you have this certain kind of story about your life that you've created, and that promotes your generativity, let's say. All right. But I think the reverse is just as likely, and I like the way you described it. And it's sort of like none of us really know how we got to be who we are. We just make stuff up, let's face it. And but we do kind of realize certain things about our lives. And so along the way, you start to see, I guess I am a pretty productive and caring person. I do care a lot for the next generation. I've never read Erik Erikson. I don't know what the heck the word generativity means, but I have a sense of myself. Like, how did I get to be this way? Maybe it's because the nuns liked me. Right? So you make the story up after the fact to provide your life with meaning and purpose. And I think that happens. I think it goes both ways. Now, with respect to research on interventions, first of all, let me say, I think that a great deal of talking therapy, be it cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, or even like classic psychoanalysis, as is still occasionally practiced, is about storytelling. It's about creating new narratives that are more life affirming to provide you, to get you out of whatever the problem is that you're in. I mean, this is a classic idea in cognitive behavioral therapy. We want to sort of change your thought patterns, your schemas and so forth, your modes for understanding your experience, and make them more life affirming. We also want to make them true to your lived experience. And so you could say that, most forms of psychotherapy in one way or another are interventions designed in part to change life stories, even if the therapist and the client don't think about it that way. There is nonetheless some, not much, but a little, that aims to get people to change their stories about certain kinds of things and looks at the impact. Some interesting research with kids in that regard. But probably the best study that's ever been done on this, and it's limited, is a piece by John Adler, former student of mine and good colleague. About 10 years ago, it came out in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And in this study, Adler followed people in therapy over 16 sessions. He had a sample of like 60 or so people, and they were in therapy over 16 sessions. And before each therapy meeting, they would sit down with somebody else. Adler wasn't the therapist, he was the researcher. They would sit down with him and they would tell a little story about what was going on that week in their lives. Then they would have the therapy session. Then they would come home. Then they'd come back a week later for the therapy session and tell Adler another little story. Okay, 16 stories over 16 sessions. Adler tracked change in the story. There were two findings that are of interest here. First of all, as the stories became higher in what's called agency, which means that the character, the protagonist in the story, feels more empowered and less helpless. As stories became more like that, and they did become more like that over time, people showed better symptomatology. There were individual assessments each week of your symptomatology, your depression, your anxiety. So there was a correlation here between improvement in the stories, that is to say, more agency for the characters in the story, and outcome. Second, the changes in the story, the increases in agency, preceded rather than followed the changes in symptomatology. In other words, you could predict down the road. Let's say in session 3, the person starts to show more agency in their little stories, and in session 4 even more. Then you could predict, well, maybe by about session 6 or 7, they're going to start to show improvement in their symptoms. And yes, that is what the statistical approach, that very sophisticated, well, beyond my means, statistical approach, or the growth curve modeling is what it's called. And Adler was able to show that. So it's a little thing, but it is some evidence to suggest that as you change your story to the extent, or as your story changes, I guess you could say, that can lead to improvement down the road. But in general, your questions, they're central to this research, and we need much, much more study of them.
Yeah, I have two questions, and they might be somewhat related. Also, they are very much related to the questions that I think we've all been asking. One is the one about the story of the redemptive self being very American. It's interesting. I had sort of the similar reaction, but also the complete opposite reaction, because I find stories like that also in people like Joseph Campbell. And sort of in Jungian, and people who very much talk about Jungian archetypes, like the hero's journey. So I was asking myself, especially also when Aku sort of told the Finnish version. The Finnish version is also a version of the hero's journey, just the ending is different. So, so maybe the American part is more like, you know, the cultural script that this hero's journey is supposed to be a success story, right? But it's still a hero's journey. So one question would so this is sort of my question, like, in what sense did you relate your research to sort of Jungian archetypal psychology and master narratives? And what about the role of different cultural scripts and expectations in these stories?
Yeah, that's great. There is no doubt that the redemptive self bears some relation to Joseph Campbell's characterization of the myth of the hero, which he sees as culturally, if not universal, pretty close to being universal. And that in many different societies, there are variations on this hero's tale. There are some differences, though. The story of the hero's tale is typically a story of a young person, young man, almost always, who journeys out into the world and so forth, and overcomes this and that, and then eventually brings home some sort of boon or gift to his people. That kind of story, it's a young man's story mainly. It's also a story of questing and change and learning new things and changing your views. The redemptive self isn't quite like that. The narrator is an older person, midlife and so forth. They are talking about their past when they were younger and so on. But there's less of this, there's that moral steadfastness thing. that idea that, I got my values together early and I haven't changed them much. And that's not kind of consistent with Campbell. Nonetheless, I think you're right that you could say that the redemptive self in some way or another is kind of an interesting variation on the myth of the hero with some significant deviations from it. And it may be the case, as you suggest, that some of these other stories that are master cultural narratives and in various societies may also have some similarities to Campbell's myth of the hero. I'm ambivalent about Campbell's work and I'm deeply ambivalent about Jung, but I won't get into that. But part of me really likes this idea that there are these fundamental scripts in our collective unconscious, if you will, that they're just deeply buried and they seem intuitive and we kind of live them out and tell them and so on. But at the same time, I'm always impressed by the uniqueness, or if not the uniqueness, the characteristic ways in which people in one culture tell stories versus in another culture. So I think going back to the first comment here, there is something that sounds very American about the redemptive self. And yeah, maybe it's a little bit of a variation on the myth of the hero, but these cultural discourses, these plots and metaphors and idioms that are specific to certain cultures are particularly interesting to me. But yeah, I think you're right on your question. Really hits the nail on the head here. It's a very interesting set of issues.
Yeah. Then thank you so much. It was a pleasure to listen to this great talk. I have a question that refers to the causal relationships among the three parts of personality. So many stage theories, beginning with Freud and Erikson, postulate that the earlier stages, let's say the traits, have influences on the other ones. So to which degree do you think can the goals or even narratives later be influenced by the traits, and the other way around, to which degree maybe goals can influence changes in the traits? We just submitted a paper where we tried to implement major life goal changes, extroversion and neuroticism within a couple of weeks. So, and I think, yeah, the traits capture so much, and it may include certain goals and so on, which may be a problem of measurement. Yeah. So, yeah, wrapping it up, how can the stages influence each other, or do you conceptualize them as orthogonal?
Yeah. I think there's a growing body of research that seeks to track relationships among the three levels of personality that I've described, and often there are some very interesting things that come up. People are there's a line of work that's all about trying to change your traits. How do you do it? Can you do it? And maybe you can do it through changing your goals, and in some way or other that might kind of feedback to change your traits. How are traits related to life stories? I already had one slide there where I suggested that the redemptive self is significantly associated with 4 of the big 5 traits, and so there are connections there as well. All my career, really going back to the 80s, I had this like strategic goal to show that life stories matter. And early on in my career, that was not an accepted point. And I felt like I was on the defensive all the time. Yeah, these are important. And so I was always trying to import the idea of narrative identity into the corpus of personality and developmental psychology research. In order to do that, I felt I needed to show that personality is bigger than traits. And it includes these other things like life stories. And these other things like life stories, they count, they matter. They're just as important. And I still feel that way, even though I think many people now accept the idea, yeah, personality has a lot of different things in it. But it didn't if you go back 30 years ago. So I still am always kind of inclined to say, yeah, there may be relationships, but I don't want to get into the situation where I'm saying traits drive it all and stories are just like an afterthought. So it's a strategic thing in my case. I want stories to hang in there. I want them to have their own thing. Nonetheless, you are surely correct in suggesting that there are likely to be interesting relationships among the three levels, and that a lot of interesting work and personality needs to be done in that regard. And I say that's great, do it, as long as they don't ultimately reduce narrative identity to traits. Because if they do that, then I'm really upset because I really do believe that narrative identity has its own thing. And I think you know this just from, like, I don't know, my experience in life and in doing some of the psychological biographies I've done. You mentioned the Donald Trump case, also wrote a piece, a book on George W. Bush years ago. I'm interested in American presidents, and their personalities are not perfectly consistent. There's contradiction. You know, the story might contradict the traits and so forth. The goals might be off in some other place. So I like it when lives show that kind of complexity and that kind of contradiction. You know, for some reason that kind of warms my heart. But yes, getting back to the point, I agree that there's good research to be done here already. It's being done, and there's likely to be overlap among the levels.